Hello, and welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about replayability. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, it's pretty simple. We like to talk about games. Replayability is something that has come up recently, I guess because we've both kind of simultaneously been stuck in, big feedback loops, right? Because you've been playing a lot of Blops. I've obviously been playing a ton of, WoW, right? And there is something about the replayability of the formula of COD, right? And the formula of World of Warcraft that draws, that draws us back in over and over again.
Yeah, and on top of that, I've been thinking about this a little bit lately because of the closure of Telltale, about how, those games have limited replayability. And
Right.
I wanted to think about, how much replayability is important. Because I think, because there's a lot of games that I will only ever play through once, right? Like, I'm never going to go back and play through, I don't know, that indie game that we talked about. Inside, yeah. I'm never going to play that again.
Sure.
And so replayability there is completely unimportant to me. But I also feel like if the game was short enough, I might, right? Like Undertale, I might, right? So, and specifically talking about these Telltale games or adventure games that have potential branching story paths, I feel like replaying it might be is part of the draw for it, right? Like you want to actually explore the decision space. Maybe not for everyone, but I think that is a draw for core fans of the genre. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I actually definitely super feel that. And I think that it is harder to replay something, almost psychologically harder or neurologically harder to replay something for its story than it is to replay something for its gameplay mechanics. I can think of a lot of games that I have played through multiple times because of their mechanics, right? A lot of the games that we come back to over and over again, Hearthstone, World of Warcraft, right? Total War, right? A lot of these are less narratively focused and they have big repeatable gameplay kind of loops. But when I think of, for instance, God, I'm trying to think of a game because a lot of these I have replayed, like Mass Effect, right? But Mass Effect is a good game, and I've replayed it a bazillion times or whatever.
Right, but that's probably your exception rather than your rule, right?
Yeah. Well, so I think that there's something about replaying a game with a very good story. I've replayed Mass Effect 2 a whole bunch, and some of that is that I think that the gameplay is sharp and it's really fun and everything. But also a lot of that is the story, right? And exploring the possibility space of that story and everything else kind of thing. But, maybe The Walking Dead Season 1 is a really good example. I played through The Walking Dead Season 1, and I have never gone back to, or had an inclination to go back to replay that game or re-experience that story. Even when, Walking Dead Season 2 came out, and I bought that on release, and played through the first, I think, 2 episodes or something. I never had that urge to go back and re-experience the original. And there is something about that I feel is kind of deeper. And in a lot of ways, I actually think that this applies outside of just games in general. And games have a big advantage on something like movies, or something like a book or something, because they have mechanics in order to create gameplay and feedback loops, right? So for instance, I find something like Man of Steel very rewatchable, right? But I find something like, Spider-Man Homecoming. I saw that once. I don't think I'm ever going to watch that movie again. Maybe I will, but I would probably be okay if I just don't go back and see it a second time. With games, you can hook somebody on a story, right? You can hook somebody on that narrative and say, oh, this is a really cool, interesting, complex story, and you're going to want to rewatch Star Wars, right, 1,000 times. But when it comes to, Undertale, yeah, I really only go through that once or twice, and once I've explored all of the different kind of story paths, I'm basically good.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I feel that, but I feel like the kind of like replayability based on story and replayability based on mechanics are almost two entirely separate realms, right? Like, I rarely replay single player heavy games, and I feel like when I do, a lot of that's for mechanics. But something I have done, and something I think makes a lot of like this a sign of the age, right? Like, if I wanted to go back and replay a game just for the story and not for any kind of like mechanical reason, I think I'm more likely to look up like the quote unquote movie version on YouTube than I am to actually play through it again for the story, because I can get those story beats without the gameplay filling in. Because I think most, this is something you've talked about before. That what's the you've got a term for it, but I can't remember. Where like the game stops and the story begins, and it's
Oh yeah, content muncher.
Content muncher,
where,
yeah.
Where you have like these explicit like breaks between what is gameplay and what is story, and they end up creating this like really frustrating, like you want to experience the story, but now you have to go and play through a physics puzzle, or you want to get to the next shooting section, but you have to sit through an unskippable cutscene.
Yeah, and I feel like most games kind of fall into that kind of trap, right? Like even ones that integrate well, if you're just kind of like want to go experience the story again, it's makes a lot more sense, I think, to go back and then just watch the story bits than it does to kind of play through the whole thing again if you're not particularly like excited about playing the gameplay again. Right, and vice versa, right? Like if I want more of the gameplay, like I'm much more likely to say pick up the multiplayer versions content in a single player game I played a lot of. I did this with Dark Souls a lot, Dark Souls 3.
Right.
Like I really enjoyed that game, and I started a second character. I basically like the story in that game is weird anyway, but like I ignored all of those elements just to kind of get to a point where I could do multiplayer content, and I did that kind of like to the maybe not the detriment, but just to the ignorance of the of kind of the single player stuff, because I really just wanted that kind of gameplay feel again. I think maybe that's kind of like indicative, right? Like we were talking about Blops, we were talking about WoW, which for the most part, even regardless of what it is, it's like it's highly loopable stuff, I guess, right? Like WoW, it's not so much multiplayer, right? It's like I don't want to put this like dailies and whatever, but it's stuff that like you can do over and over again, right? Multiplayer.
Yeah, I mean, I think the loop is even smaller than that. Like, I think that the core loop on WoW is running up to something, doing a, pressing the buttons in the correct order, and then, getting a reward out of it. Whether that reward is, raid gear or PvP gear or whatever, right? Like I think that the core of that loop of running around moving through the world and pressing your buttons in certain ways is like the loopable replayability of WoW.
No, that makes sense. So something just popped into my head that's very related to this, right? Like WoW, presumably you always have your like progression towards some rep, some piece of gear. Black Ops, like I remember, back in the day when you used to play just like play a match and see if you won or not. But I feel like more and more, especially for these shorter experiences, you need some form of like external progression to really drive that home, right? Like when I'm playing Blops, a big part of that drive is a drive to like level up in Blops. That's why they have prestiging, because once you hit the top, there's no more progression anymore, so you want to reset that. This is also typically how I burn out on WoW, right? Like once I hit a point where like the returns are very diminishing, I stop caring. And then something even like one of these Telltale games, right? Like, or one of these, any types of these adventure games, you play through until you've basically exhausted the story content and there's nothing left. And, maybe this drives it why like choices not mattering is so disappointing to some people, right? Because like you've put forth the effort to explore the new content, but there's nothing there, right? Like you get your prize and it's not satisfying. Does that make sense?
Yes. And I think that's kind of like the neurological piece of this, I guess.
Yeah.
Because that's what happens with like a Skinner box or whatever, right? Like at a certain point, the Skinner box runs out and you don't get like the dopamine hit anymore, and it no longer feels good. And I sort of wonder how much of that requires like sort of like tolerance breaks. Like this, this is gonna make me sound like a crazy drug addict or whatever. But like, if you smoke a lot of weed, it's not uncommon for someone to take what's called like a tolerance break, where you take a break from smoking weed for 6 months, so that you can build back, so that your tolerance can deplete to whatever it is, whatever the chemical is. And then when you smoke again, it like feels good again, and you can like get as high as you used to, sort of thing. And I sort of think that a lot of games encourage, and a lot of loops people fall into with games is a very similar thing, right? Like when I play Total War every 3 or 6 months when they put out a content update, right? That is kind of me doing like me taking a tolerance break. And then in 2 weeks when they release the Vampire Coast and I get to play Vampy Pirate Boys, right? All of a sudden I'm going to play Total War again, and it's going to, like feel like new because I haven't played it for 3 months. And I think the same thing happens with WoW, the same thing happens with Hearthstone, the same thing happens with games with sequels, right? Like Assassin's Creed games or whatever. I even think to a certain extent this is also something that bleeds over to other media, right? Like we've talked about the reason Solo failed at the box office is because it's 6 months after The Last Jedi. Yeah, to a certain extent, I think there needed to be a bigger tolerance break in between Star Wars movies. Though I think it is much more prominent in like the video game space, just because like the loop is more definable and in a certain sense more like predatory, right? Like especially when we talk about like loot boxes and shit like that, right? Like that loop gets predatory quickly because there's money on the line.
Yeah, I mean, and even if you aren't directly paying for like a box, right? Like that's, call it predatory or not, that's kind of like the fundamental loop in WoW, right? Like it's a loop. It is a loot box. It's just one that you don't pay for, right? Like
it's one that you pay a flat fee for every month. Right?
Yeah.
And I've definitely had that happen where like all of a sudden the Skinner box turns off and I'm just like, like I get a piece of gear or whatever and I'm like, oh man, wait, what? Why am I here?
Yeah.
What am I doing? You know what I mean? Like all of these goals that you kind of set for yourself. And I think that that's actually a good aspect of WoW, right? In that there are a lot of different goals to have. And if you want to be somebody who makes 5 million gold in getting the Stompy Boy mount, or if you want to be somebody who gets an all mythic raid gear, or if you want to be somebody who gets gladiator and PvP or whatever, right? Like there's a lot of different kind of goals for you to attain, but there is a certain like emptiness that comes with like, I just attained my goal, whatever it was, and everything else has just kind of like fallen away.
Yeah. And like, if that goal, like, it's always like the weirdest thing for me, right? Because I think about this with Diablo a lot, right? Because Diablo is a game that I consistently, every once in a while, I was like, I want to play a fucking loot game, and I'll go play that game, and I'll go play it for like 10 hours and like 10 hours straight even, right? And then I'll get to the diminishing returns point. I'll be like, I'm fucking done, right? Like I'll get like the last piece of like the gear I need for the set I'm working on, and I'll be like, yes, I got it. And then I'll like play like 10 more minutes to actually fucking use it, right? And see the effect that I've gotten, right? To just like run through some greater rift. I'll be like, all right, well, the next goal is either like some rare drop or like just some like weird iterative thing that like gives me marginally more power. I'm like,
right,
well, I guess I'm done. Even like I worked so hard to get there. This even happens in Black Ops a lot, right? It's so, just to be clear, it's been a double XP weekend, so I've been playing like crazy this weekend. And it's like leveling up stuff, right? It's like, oh man, I am so excited to get each weapon, or not every weapon, most weapons have, when you hit max level, you can unlock a special mod for them that does something really neat, right? Like for the light machine gun I use, it's a suppressor, it's called the oppressor, and when you shoot the gun, enemies near you get suppressed. Or like the one that Monic's been using a lot is it's a light machine gun, and the top one is you dual wield them, right?
Oh shit.
Yeah. And so like I've been playing, it's like I get it, right? Like and I use it for like 2 matches. I'm like, this is really cool. And it's like, but I can prestige this weapon and I can earn all that stuff over again. And I hit the button and I start doing it again. And like obviously I don't think that has like the longest legs, right? Like at some point I'm not going to be happy doing that again. But especially kind of like in this double XP environment where like I'm regaining those levels really rapidly, so it doesn't feel as heavy. That's like, I don't know, that just like feeling is like super, like the ability to reset has this like really weird effect where I like really want to do it, even though like I've attained the thing that I really want to do and only use it for a short period of time. I don't know.
Okay, so my question then kind of becomes, is the only way to create these sorts of replayability loops to make it goal-oriented, right? Is there such thing as like a replayability loop that isn't like some sort of like goal-oriented loop? And like my default is to say, obviously not. All of the loops that we're talking about are always goal-oriented, right? And you repeat the loop in order to accomplish that goal, whatever it is, sort of thing. But like, is there such a thing where the loop is the loop and it is fun enough to sustain itself?
So
you know what I mean?
So one, I'm going to point to the fact that it didn't always used to be this way. And maybe those were just like less addicting, but right, like
yeah, that's true. Yeah, it didn't used to be this way. Yeah, whoa, it super didn't used to be this way. But there were always still goals in games like Super Mario 64 or whatever, right?
Right.
Like getting stars and
Yeah, but like you play that game to completion, right? Like, and if you're replaying that, maybe you're replaying that to just like get a faster time or whatever people do for fun post game. Not that any of that stuff has ever dragged me in, but we've talked about like watching stuff about like speedruns before that motivates some people.
But speedruns are also goal oriented.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, no,
like,
that's my point. Yeah.
I bet the answer would be like Minecraft, maybe.
So I do.
Just like,
I also have another answer, which is strategy games, right? Like Civ and CK2 and EU4, right? Like you don't replay those games to move towards like a greater end goal. It's just that the loops on those are super long, and so the loop itself is satisfying, if that makes sense.
And the goals are also long inside. Yeah. Like okay, this is what it is. I think I see it. There's kind of like an interior loop goal and an exterior loop goal, right? So like for instance, COD has exterior loop goals where you cycle the loop a bunch of times, and it kind of and it feeds into a bigger, greater goal, like. Or like League of Legends or something like that, where you're trying to get to level 30 and unlock all of your runes or whatever it is. I'm sure they've changed that system by now.
The other thing about like League and something like Rocket League is that the exterior loop goal is also ranking, right? Like that is its own kind of exterior loop goal.
Right, yeah. But then when you have something like Total War or Civ, the goal is interior to the loop,
right?
Because the loop is so big and so long that it can be a kind of in a lot of ways, it has the same lifespan as those exterior loops, because like your whole game of Total War is going to be 10 to 20 hours, right? And that's about the amount of time it takes for you to, accomplish whatever sort of exterior goals that you're constantly cycling on the treadmill in WoW or in Blops or something like that, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I wonder if there's anything else besides strategy games that has that really long loop. Or that really long loop like that.
Yeah, it's
strategy games really like lend themselves to this. To a certain extent, I think certain RPGs do too. Like maybe I'd say some of like kind of the classic RPGs, or even RPGs along the lines of like the big single player RPGs like Deus Ex or like Dragon Age or Mass Effect are kind of like this. But like the loop for Final Fantasy VII is interior, because like at the end of the day it's just to complete the game, and that's a 40-hour experience, right?
Yeah. I guess so something that just popped in my head is roguelikes, because you're like,
oh, that's interesting,
each delve is a loop, right?
Yeah.
And you're basically playing until you hit the loop where you beat the game, right? But the way I typically play those games is I play for a while, and either like I stop playing because I'm done, or like I'm tired of it, or I hit a particularly good run and I stop after I've died that run, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's like I've made as much progress as I'm going to have made for today, right? Like even though that progress is independent of all the other progress I've made. So it's time for me to take a break and be done with it. Because I guess it's like, I don't know. In some ways, it's kind of like running a dungeon over and over in WoW, right? Like, you know, when you do it once you've hit the hit like you've gotten your piece of gear or whatever, right? Like, there's no guarantee that this particular iteration of the loop is going to make me hit my end goal, but when I do, then I'm done. Or like when I get far enough that like it would be frustrating, continue further, which I think is really interesting, right? Because most genres, if like I get frustrated, I just stop. But roguelikes, that's like part of the core formula, right?
Yeah, in a certain sense, I almost think roguelikes are both. Like, I've played a lot of FTL, and I think FTL is a really good game and like a good roguelike. But I am never motivated by the exterior loop.
Right.
Which is like earning new ships and stuff like that. Like, I just find playing the game fun enough in and of itself, and I don't play it hardcore enough to, like, there are people who know, you know, like, there are people who know, like, the procedural generation, like, underlying things or whatever, and I'm nowhere near, like, that hardcore player. And so just kind of going through with, like, the basic ships and, like, oh, you did whatever, and then you earn, you know, whatever, like, that's like good enough for me. But I think that for other people, for like more hardcore players, that exterior loop is important, and being able to earn, you know, the new ships, and you want to get the different, you know, like different play styles or whatever, and that's kind of an interesting, like, it blends sort of across that line in a way that other games sort of don't.
It's interesting you bring up FTL, because Into the Breach, you know, the other game that company made, like,
yeah,
I really liked that game, but as soon as I beat it for the first time, I almost immediately dropped entirely off of it. I've played like maybe like 30 minutes total of that game past the first time I beat it. And it's definitely a game that's meant to be beat multiple times. You get to unlock multiple different crews. There's more pilots. There's a whole bunch of stuff that means that you're supposed to play this game multiple times, but I can't get myself invested in it for whatever reason, right?
There's also no randomizer in that game, right?
What do you mean?
I thought I read an article about this, how like everything in the game was there was no randomization to how stuff always spawns the same way. It always spawns in the same places, and the moves are all tactical. They're never random, right? So like the enemy moves will always be like the AI is always
so I don't know about the overworld stuff. Yeah, I don't know about the overworld stuff, but like a big part of it is that everything that happens on the tactical map is like, it's not it's not the same, I think, as what you might think it is. It's like it's not super predictable, like outside of the round, like the current round that you're doing, but you know everything that's going to happen before it happens, right? Like there's only one piece of random chance, I think, in like the actual execution. Otherwise, things will always kind of resolve the way that you see them. But like, it's not like, you know, bugs will always move in the same way. It's that like the bug will tell you what it's going to do before it actually does it, and you always have a chance to respond to it, and you never have to guess.
Right, but that bug also makes the decision of where it's going to move according to like factors or whatever. And so for instance, if I keep save scumming in other games that don't have any kind of like randomizer protection, you might be able to catch the AI make a different move than they would otherwise make because there's a randomizer inside of their decision making, which I think is bad and lazy and isn't super common, I feel like, these days. I feel like most games I play don't have so much of that. But yeah, I was under the impression, I guess, that Into the Breach didn't have a randomizer on that kind of like level, and that it was supposed to be like a chess match, right?
Yeah.
Where there is no RNG to how things resolve on the chessboard.
So that is absolutely true. But if the bugs have like AI that is super like that is like predictable, it's not like it's not like you would sit down there and be like, oh, that's obviously what that person was going to do. Like, to me, it appears that,
especially because, I mean, I'm sure that the AI accounts for whatever you bring into the battle, right, and stuff like that. And so in a certain sense, there is a randomizer, and that randomizer is the fact that you're never going to enter the same battle under the exact same conditions.
Right. Also, the maps are randomized to some degree, right? Like,
really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like cool. Each battle you fight isn't a set stage. It's like variations on the same kind of themes depending on what you're doing.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But like I said, the bigger thing is that like if like it would be like playing a game of chess, right? Like in sure, if you're playing chess versus a computer, like if you think about it enough, you could probably figure out what the computer is going to do. But like for a normal person, it's going to be opaque, right? Like
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that is another core piece of sort of replayability loops, is that kind of like variation and diversity and randomizer aspect to it, right? Like things like chess or checkers or Scrabble or whatever. Well, Scrabble I guess also has a randomizer. Like kind of notwithstanding, like most video games have kind of random. What's that super random? I might call it sort of like syncopation, like in music, right? Where like you're filling in a bunch of different things, like you're kind of filling in the blanks or whatever. And so like, yeah, at the end of the day, when I'm killing blood trolls in Nazmir versus killing pirates in Tiragard Sound, right, those enemies are typically not all that meaningfully different, but like their makeup and cosmetic difference might be sort of enough to have it feel like varied or diverse or something kind of along those lines. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think I do. That makes sense.
And like to a certain extent, there is like I think WoW is better than this, right? Like typically enemy types will behave similarly, so like, you know, blood trolls will have a cast of a spell or whatever, and the more blood trolls you fight, the more you might realize, oh, I need to interrupt that spell or else it's going to heal them or something like that. And like kind of vice versa with pirates and stuff like that. So there are very kind of like low level mechanics that do differentiate the two groups. But at the end of the day, right, like that's just fill to make the to like divvy up the pattern a little bit and make it feel like you're not doing exactly the same thing, even if you are functionally doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it's really strange that kind of like WoW like does so well with this, even though like I don't know, I find that like it's like the core loop itself is not particularly compelling, right? Especially with like regular mobs. And I think that this is like why I fell off this time, is that I didn't care enough to like kill random mobs, because like, you know, regardless, I'm able to just kind of like bowl over them all, right? Like I find like raiding very satisfying generally, and like the more pressure based, like the mythic dungeon stuff very satisfying, but like the only thing that the core loop in WoW does is to serve the exterior loop goals, which you know, it just feels very. It's weird that it works so well. Maybe that's just like the you know, says something about Skinner boxes more than anything else.
No, yeah, I super feel that. I mean, I think that a lot of those exterior loop goals, in a weird way, WoW kind of has so many of them that I feel like it's easy to kind of get like lost with a bunch. Like you're leveling professions, and maybe you're, you know, and so you have these kind of like Russian nesting dolls of like goals or whatever, right? You're leveling your profession, or it's even bigger than that, right? Like you're doing your world quests in order to get reps so that you can level your profession better, so that you can make gold, so that you can get a mount or something kind of, you know, like there are all of these different incremental pieces, and it's easy to get kind of like lost in there. And you find yourself leveling up multiple tunes to, you know, oh, I'm going to make sure that I'm gemmed and enchanted because my goal is raiding or whatever. And so I need to have a character that's an alchemist, and a character that's a jewel crafter, and a character that's an enchanter, so that I can be raid ready on my main character at all times or whatever, right? Like that sort of thing is what like underlies, I feel like, WoW. And it's just because like the loops are like nested in that way that makes it so like so replayable for like the hardcore.
Even if the individual things, like the individual loop itself isn't super compelling. That's interesting. Yeah, I made this joke like one day. I was like, I guess I was talking to Enoch or maybe Charles. Somebody was playing one of those like clicker hero type games, like especially the ones that like eventually like play themselves, right? Like you just like let it roll.
Yeah, you buy enough upgrades, and it's like it'll just go for fucking forever.
Yeah, and then it's like, I remember making this show. It's like, haha, that's stupid. As I hit the same 4 keys on my keyboard to kill a bunch of things in World of Warcraft, right? Like,
yeah, no, I get it. That's crazy.
Yeah, I guess those clicker games are kind of like the most base distillation of that kind of like replayability loop, right? It's like numbers go up, right? Like this makes me happy and warm inside because the numbers have gone up as I watch them, which is just like such a weird kind of like animalistic lizard brain thing. It's like things big, good, yes. Like, oh man, that's depressing. What are we doing, buddy?
Yeah, that really is depressing to a certain extent. This has happened to me in other situations before too, where like you just kind of like, because like it spirals out of control, and eventually you're just like, I'm a floating speck of dust.
Yeah, right.
Nothingness of the universe. You know what I mean? Like, because like when you think about basically any game, they are just like elaborate time wasters.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely.
And of course it's tough to when you kind of like unplug that cork in the bottom of the rowboat. It's tough to stop sinking.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I also think to a certain extent replayability is determined by social interaction. He said, expert segue after like the nihilism, right? But like to a certain extent, like I think WoW or Blops or whatever it is more replayable because of the social environment around that replayability, right? So for instance, playing WoW with my guild that is full of my friends, right? It's easy for me to lose myself in the loop or loops of, running around farming herbs or fishing or whatever it is, when I'm sitting in Discord and we're all hanging out together, right? And talking. And I think that's a powerful effect. And to a certain extent, I think that's a benefit to games like WoW and like Blops and like League of Legends and like, whatever else, where it is a detriment to games like The Walking Dead, right? I think it's much harder to have that kind of like a social experience with something like The Walking Dead.
Yeah, and I mean, like anything that's like a story-based single-player experience is not going to be able to like really hone in on those things, right? Because like that social experience, like you can talk about like kind of like different aspects of the story and what they mean, right? Like Dark Souls is infamous for kind of like discussions of like what's actually happening, since the story's kind of parceled out in weird bits and pieces. But you don't really need to play the game more than once to get in on that, right? You don't even need to play the game once, right? Like you just need to like read some stuff, like some text excerpts or like watch some YouTube videos to kind of get like into that aspect of it. But just thinking about something else that I've been dabbling into. I've been playing some Devil May Cry 4, just because like last week I said I was hyped for Devil May Cry 5, and I'll talk a little bit more about more general things about that in the back half hour. But a big part of that game is doing things stylishly, right? And so part of the game is replaying the segments so you could get a higher score, like a higher style score. And this is just basically like a high score mechanic. It's a little bit more abstracted because you're not like just getting points, and it's a little bit harder to maximize than like like a classic arcade game. But do you find those kinds of loops compelling, right? Like doing like this is another big numbers thing, but like doing the same thing again, but to try and get a bigger number on it, but just like that's the only end goal. It doesn't actually serve a longer purpose. Like,
I used to find that more compelling than I do today, and in a certain sense, that's like kind of like the achievement points loop,
right?
Where like I have 100% completion in Mass Effect 2 on the Xbox 360, right? Because I went through and I did every single achievement which required multiple playthroughs because you need to do a certain number of things while on a certain level of difficulty or whatever. So I've beaten that game on like insane twice or something like that. But I guess I don't typically assign a ton of value to that. At least in like a single player sort of experience. And I think that there is a kind of, a tree falls in the forest there, but it doesn't make a sound aspect to this, which, which kind of requires, a group of people to validate that and validate you in a way, right? And this is what I think kind of underlies the speedrunning community in a lot of ways, right? Like, it is not that you got the achievement, you got all of the achievement points and that is internally fulfilling, right? Or whatever. And I mean, to a certain extent that is, right? But I also got those achievement points so that I could fucking brag about it. And I think when you are speedrunning, speedrunning doesn't happen inside of a vacuum. Speedrunning happens when you can post it on forums and compare tips and tricks with other sort of people, right?
Right.
Humans are social beings and we form communities that value certain things, right? And one of those things might be, how fucking quickly can we speed run a thing? And you need like an external, you need some other group there to sort of, to stamp whatever it is that you're doing in order to like get that feedback of, this feels good. I'm awesome for breaking this world record or whatever. Right.
Yeah. This is weird because I'm thinking about this in terms of like, I wanted to play some more of this game, right? Like I beat, a game, right? And I want to play more of that game, but I don't feel like it would be satisfying to do so unless I've got some kind of other motivation to do it, right? In this kind of way, right? Like I need to do it again or I need to do it enough to get this achievement, which gives me the excuse to play the game, which is what I really want to do. And theoretically, I should just want to play the game because that's what I actually want to do. It's a weird set of motivations. And
and in a way, this is kind of why I think I might say that a goal is necessary. I don't know how true that is because my guess would be that for certain games and for certain ages, that's not true. The big example in my mind being like Minecraft. I think if you're somebody that does like creative Minecraft, you aren't necessarily goal oriented. And you're just kind of exploring and expressing yourself. And maybe to a certain extent, like you could say that like building a thing is like a goal or whatever. Or like building one of these crazy contraptions so that you can put it on like r/Minecraft or something like that, or like make Minecraft YouTube videos. But yeah, there are definitely like, I feel like there are definitely games where the loop is the goal, right? Where you're just playing the loop and there is no goal that you say, all you need to do is essentially suffer through this loop over and over again. We're tricking you into doing it or something kind of like that, where you just sort of like walk into it and get it done. Because like, even in games that I love a lot and I think are very good, I am typically goal oriented with it, where I say, I want to beat the game. I want to beat, Total War Warhammer with the vampire counts. And so it gives me a bunch of victory conditions and I fulfill those victory conditions. Or, I'm playing through Dragon Age and I want to do a Renegade playthrough or a Paragon playthrough or kind of like whatever else.
Yeah. So I want to step back for 1 second and just kind of address the thing we talked about before, is that it didn't used to be like this, right?
Right.
And I've got like two theories in my mind. One is that like, somehow we're ruined by the progression and like this is a bad thing. But the other one is maybe those games just like weren't as good, but they were all we had. So we didn't have since we didn't have the opportunity to have a game of that form factor with these kind of external progression goals, it was just the best that we got. And maybe we just didn't care as much about them, right? Like that's got to be a possibility, right? Like when I didn't care about progressing my weapons in COD and I was playing like TF2 on like a random CTF server, right? I was doing that beyond the social aspects. I was doing it just because it was fun in itself, but I probably also wasn't playing for like 6 hours straight on a Sunday because it's double XP weekend, right? Does that sound right? And maybe that's just also my age too, right? Like I didn't have as much freedom to do that back when I could, play it for 6 hours a day, and maybe I would have if that was open to me. But maybe these games are just better. Does that make sense?
I think we are also older,
Yeah.
I think a lot of this, I played World of Warcraft when I was a teenager, and I had no conception for the stuff that I do now because I'm just that much more advanced a player, right? And I think about this a lot when I think of WoW, and I think of things like Recount or Sims, right? And those things happened. They existed. They existed in Wrath of the Lich King. They existed in Burning Crusade or whatever. But like, I think we get better at things as time goes along, right? And we got better at World of Warcraft, and we got better at COD, and we just kind of have ended up in a position where we are better at... We got into a position where we are better at these games than they are good sometimes. And I feel like when you can really clearly see through the loop and not engage, right? Like when that turns you off, that is like the problem. And I feel like I've had that experience a couple of times, though. I have a harder time remembering bad games compared to remembering good ones.
Yeah, and I see your point, and I definitely do think that there's like an age component to it, right? Like I'm sure that like you could get a kid hooked on a game without these exterior loops, just for itself easier than you could an adult. But like that also doesn't change the fact that like when we were kids, there were older people also playing this game and these games, and I don't think that they were particularly less invested. I don't think they were...
Oh no, I mean, I think that is a factor, right? Just because somebody's an adult doesn't mean that they are necessarily like better at this. And in a lot of ways, I think that the progression we've seen like as a culture is because like we as a culture are maturing through, I now have 30 years of 28 years of gaming experience under my belt, right? Whereas if I'm an adult in the 90s, yeah, I've been playing DOS games or whatever, right? But like I don't have the same kind of like foundation that we do now with 3 decades of like experience underneath it.
I get that. That makes sense.
And I also think that there's a technology aspect to it too, right? Where it's like, to a certain extent, I sort of feel like we gather experience and we learn how to do these things, as like like as a community, as a group or whatever sort of thing, and so we are constantly getting better and better at playing games and understanding games and all that sort of thing. But I also think that technology is a counteractive force to that, where like new technology is being released, and so we need to remake ourselves and our new understanding in order to like account for that. So like the big example of this would be moving from a 2D game space to a 3D game space, right? Where we made Super Mario and like Spyro or whatever, those kinds of games, and they were hard and tough because those games were not those were new innovations, and we didn't know how to play them, and developers didn't know how to design them, and over time we had to kind of like, in the same way that we refined the 2D platformer, we had to refine 3D open world spaces in games in order to like make that work, right? And over time we had to refine 3D FPSs from Doom to Halo to COD or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It does make a lot of sense.
And to a certain extent, I almost sort of like wonder, like, is there an end point, or do we just continue refining and inventing new stuff, right? Like this is a very positive argument for something like VR, which both of us have kind of been like down on to one extent or another over the lifetime of the cast or whatever, right? But like, if there is if we're constantly looking for new barriers to break through in order to challenge ourselves, reorienting ourselves as a VR playing game community is kind of like the next one of those barriers, I would say. Yeah,
no, that makes sense. Along the line of thinking, why hasn't this kind of like, I'm going to call it, it's going to sound very negative, I'm going to call this like replayability rot, infected like board games and tabletop games?
I think it has, though. See, that's also interesting. I think that replayability rut has infected board games and tabletop games. I think the new board games that we are seeing now are much more complex, much more complicated, right?
That's
and
fair.
people aren't content to sit around and play fucking Scrabble or Sorry, right? You know what I mean? We have to play stuff like Gloomhaven or, you know, whatever else. Scythe, right?
Sure.
Because I think that we have a common we have like a common foundation of games like Sorry or you know whatever, and we are getting those games become more complex and more complicated and more intricate over time in order to match with our expanded capacity to play, learn, and understand them. And in the same vein, I also think RPGs have gone through that. Like the progression from first edition D&D to AD&D to third edition to Pathfinder is in a lot of ways that progression, right? We as Pathfinder players recognize a lot of the imbalance issues that are present in 3.5 in a way that 3.5 players didn't necessarily at the time. And a lot of that is, you know, like I think that there are a couple of different pieces of that progression which I find interesting, right? Like when we made the jump from owning a book equals knowledge to owning a USB drive of PDFs equals knowledge, I think that was the thing that really cemented the kind of kill shot on 3.5's balance. Because it would have been impossible. You know, it's practically impossible for you to have every book in 3.5 without being exorbitantly wealthy, right? And especially, you know, like when a lot of us are playing as like kids or teenagers, right? Like, yeah, maybe you get the Magic of Incarnum because that book looks cool. Or maybe you get Complete Warrior because you like to play martial characters or whatever. But a lot of those like really crazy, really out there interactions happen when you're combining feats and prestige classes from multiple different books, right? And like interactions from like multiple different sort of books. And when we made that jump to having, you know, a select few of those at our disposal to having what is essentially the SRD at our disposal, made a huge difference.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. That does make a lot of sense because, I mean, another part of this too is like, you know, not only is easier to access books, but it's also easier to like go on forums and find people who are finding, like, you know, before you would have to like sit down with all the books and figure it out yourself, right? And like cross.
Oh yeah, no, that's so true. Yeah,
and like
because at a certain point, you know, it's not just you and your friends, right? This happened to me in like Magic, right? And I feel like this happens to a lot of people in fighting games as well, where you create these like little tiny solar systems of metagames, and then all of a sudden you get exposed to the galaxy.
Basement,
you know, like
Kings.
When it's just like me and my friends playing Smash, I'm the best Smash player. But then I go to college and, you know, I get trounced immediately because somebody from another solar system is like way better than me. Or I start playing online and I get trounced immediately because, you know, the online player is like way better than me. Yeah. No, that's real. The internet.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, I almost kind of like wonder, is there something so complicated or complex that like the internet can't effectively decode it, you know, to make like the optimal strategies and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of like more, well, I mean, they're to answer that question, I think part of the answer is this push you see in the RPG space a lot towards more story oriented games where like it's just impossible to optimize because the game's not designed for that.
Well, that's actually very true.
And I think the other half of this is, I think part of the danger is this internet speak kind of invents problems that are more theoretical than they are real, right? Like, we talked about this briefly off the chat, and you brought this up as maybe something we could talk about in an episode, but like, this kind of like sleeping in the dungeon problem, the 15-minute adventuring day.
Oh yeah, the 15-minute adventuring day.
Yeah. I feel like the 15-minute adventuring day is like 90 to 95% completely like a theoretical problem made out of whole cloth, right? Like, I think 95% of the times your players aren't going to be like, well, I want to sleep, so I have full resources. Like, after every encounter, like they'll play like reasonable people. And like, you know, maybe there's some like tuning issues on the edges of it, right? Like the issues aren't actually with the 15-minute adventuring day. It's on like the 12-hour adventuring day, where like maybe they sleep every 8 instead of every 12 hours, and like the tuning there's off a little bit, and like maybe and I think that like just this ton of this, just the ability for anybody to kind of come up with these things on the internet comes up with a lot of things that aren't really real, or on the other hand sometimes they are real, right? Like I think that like a lot of these like guides, right? Like there's like guides for Pathfinder characters are like systemized, right? They're all like these Word documents that have like the same coloring scheme. They're like, this is the optimal feat, this is the least optimal feat, and those can like like give you like up to like eighth, I would say, on like for like the, if you really follow them to the T, like get like 80% more character out of your, or power out of your character if you're just like playing for power, which we've talked about this before. I think that's the legitimate way to enjoy the game, but like the other half of this, or the other part of that, which is like the invented stuff, I wonder if we spend too much time trying to fix those problems.
I do sort of wonder about that, because I think some of these problems are legitimate, right?
Yeah.
The obvious answer is like cure light wounds. I think wands of cure light wounds are a legitimate problem,
right?
That deserve to kind of be fixed. But to a certain extent, I think it's like an accessibility thing. Going to a store and buying a wand of cure light wounds, or a bunch of wands of cure light wounds, by like rules as written, is pretty easy, right? You just kind of need to have enough gold in order to get there, and in order to do it, and then using them is basically trivial.
Yeah.
And hypothetically speaking, it is equally trivial to do the 15-minute adventuring day. But for some reason, the Wand of Cure Light Wounds strategy doesn't trigger kind of like almost like a realism impulse in characters the same way that I think the 15-minute adventuring day does. Like, I think people avoid the 15-minute adventuring day because it is unrealistic and it doesn't like make sense, and players are invested in the immersion and realism of the world to a certain extent, just as much as they are to the power, and that's a trade-off in a lot of ways that players aren't sort of like willing to make. But I don't think that that same trade-off is made around something like the Wand of Cure Light Wounds, or like, I'm trying to think of like other problems that are sort of like that, that are the extreme version but also real.
That people actually use. Yeah.
But I definitely agree with you. I think a lot of things are like theoretical. I also think that a lot of things are more like specific. I've seen this in kind of like hyper persuade builds of characters where like, they're all about charming people in order to like win fights, or like, so for instance, if you are somebody who specs out a crazy disarm character that can just like without any fail disarm anybody, so anytime they fight, when they fight the big bad with his sword or whatever, well, that person's just gonna walk up and take his super magical sword and throw it away, and like it's gonna like fuck on them, or kind of like whatever. But I think that there's a certain like balance aspect built into the game, which is that like, okay, well, what if the big bad is a dragon? What do you do then? You know what I mean? And so like, to a certain extent, there is a little bit of like breadth answers that hyper optimization, problem or whatever. But I don't know. I also think that it's and I think part of the core fantasy, or like the fantasy is kind of the wrong word, but like part of the core engagement about playing games, both tabletop and regular video games, is a refinement of tactics and strategy to get better over time, right? I am a better Tetris player than I was when I first played Tetris, because I understand more about the game, and as my understanding increased, my strategies increased in their efficiency and effectiveness, and that sort of thing sort of continues more and more. And maybe it's just like there is a cap to it. Like eventually you just out strategize whatever the game is, and there's nothing you can really do about it. And at that point, is the game replayable at all? I don't know. Maybe the answer is no. Um,
Yeah.
from like a gameplay perspective, I think games will always be replayable from like a narrative perspective. Because I think that if you have a good replayable narrative, right, that kind of doesn't exhaust itself.
Right. I think.
But it does. But you do have to take bigger tolerance breaks. I don't really think that somebody can play Dragon Age 2 back to back to back to back to back. Dragon Age 2 might be a bad example, but I don't think somebody can play Mass Effect 2 back to back to back to back to back. Right? You play Mass Effect 2 and then you come back to it, and then you come back to it, and then you come back to it. And so maybe it's something that you watch, that you play through like you watch Star Wars, where maybe once every 2 years, you watch it again. Or something kind of along those lines. But it's not something that you're doing over and over and over again, back to back, in the same way that you would with a gameplay loop like Blops or like WoW.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like we really got to the bottom of this one. A lot of the times I feel like we end our episode with like, those are a bunch of thoughts. They're not really conclusive at all. But yeah.
Yeah, no, we also like went far afield with this one too, right? Like we ended up talking about the 15-minute adventuring day.
Right, but I mean, I think, so I think the 15-minute adventuring day is a big replayability thing.
Yeah.
Right? Because the first time you play D&D, none of that stuff occurs to you. But as you play it over and over again and you get better and better at the game, part of that getting better and better at the game is creating first-order optimal strategies, right?
Yeah.
Of which the 15-minute adventuring day can be one.
Yeah.
And I always sort of like wonder if the answer is just to like ramp complication. Like Europa Universalis is a game that is ramped for players. I mean, even me, I haven't played EU4 in like a year. And that's not true. I played EU4 4 months ago. Whoops. But I haven't played EU4 in a while, but there are people who play EU4 all the time, and they're playing constantly. And the developers of that game don't cater to me, and they don't cater to you. They cater to the players who are playing constantly, and they are making the game more complex and trying to continually up the threshold for strategy, right? That you need to that you need to surmount in order to like achieve that level of mastery in the game that you want to achieve. And to a certain extent, I think that might be the only way to sort of like combat this problem. But that creates its own burnout, because boy, is EU4 a really fucking complicated game. And constantly outmoding all of the work that people do in order to learn it might be a way to keep your top level players invested, but it's going to cause other players to fall off.
Yeah.
So yeah.
A thought occurs to me, like every year we go to Gen Con, and every year we play a bunch of games that we never have played before. And is that just kind of like an expression of our desire to kind of recapture that magical first session of D&D? Because we can't optimize those games, and And to
a certain extent, I think that we walk into this problem when we repeat games, right? Like when we come back for a third year of 7th Sea. Well, 7th Sea was great the first time, right? And it was great the second time too, to be fair. But maybe we'll do it next year, and we'll be like, you know what, man, I'm a little 7th Sea out. Maybe you're like that. We won't look for that game, or whatever it is. I mean, that's exactly what we did with Pathfinder, right? When we played the Starfinder Society game, and we were all kind of like, that's not really worth our time.
Yeah, and oh god, yeah, that's really like, because I've been like looking at this and been like, I really had a good time with Orc. I really had a good time with Luchador, Mask of the Luchador, and I bought those Luchador books, and I'd love to go, like, I feel like I could play that again, but like once I started digging down into it, like how much of the fun would I optimize out for myself, right? Like,
yeah,
and I think that's not like the end all be all of that discussion, right? Like I think that there's like aspects of this kind of storytelling stuff, right? Like where like games that are more story focused have less of these problems because it's harder to optimize. Although I think that like that can be less fun for people. Like I think there's more issues there that we could dive into at some point. That kind of factor, but I do think that kind of like that freshness aspect is a big factor. And like I think that Seventh Sea has worked for as long as it is, because we do have a good tolerance. We have like year-long tolerance breaks for that game. Maybe this year was bad because we played that Seventh Sea game in the middle of the year, and we didn't have our long enough tolerance breaks.
Oh my god, yeah, maybe.
Although I think there's parts of that are also like GM based, right? Like that are.
I mean, I actually enjoyed our second session of 7C better than the first, and I think that was just because we got like a stellar GM.
Yeah,
right? I mean, the guy is a professional GM and works on the 7C game, and so he has like a real mastery of like the system in the world and everything. So we really lucked out.
We did. I don't know. I really like the first session too, but that's just me.
No, I definitely really like the first session too. I just feel like there are definitely sort of like maybe I'd call that like a coefficient or whatever, right? Like it's not. It doesn't make or break the experience, but it enhances a good experience more. It's like multiplicative in a way. I don't know. I shouldn't be trying to like quantitatively,
Yeah.
This is like an actuarial table. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I think really at the end of the day, people want innovation. They want new things, and that's what kind of drives replayability, right? Like, can you create new stuff for people to get invested in? Because no loop rules forever. Son, like
I that's like the big draw of like emergent gameplay type stuff, right? Like that you're making.
It's the reason that games like League and World of Warcraft have patches, right? To give people new content to churn through as they like work through things.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I think we did actually thoroughly cover the topic. So
yeah, I know. I really like the phrase, by the way. This is like maybe future episode topic or whatever, but optimizing the fun out of it.
Yeah.
Right. Like I think that is something that happens all the time.
Yeah.
And And
there's a really good essay. I'll try to remember to put it up. I've probably referenced it before. It's called "Water Finds a Crack," by one of the Civ guys. I believe it's the same guy who does the Designer Notes podcast.
Cool.
Yeah. It's basically like, a player given the opportunity will optimize the fun out of their situation. To do things as efficiently as possible.
Well, we'll talk about that sometime later. How's your week?
Week's been good. What did I do? I played a lot of Black Ops. So it's talk about external rewards, right? Like, I've been playing a bunch of Blackout and like some multiplayer because I've always really liked multiplayer COD, not for like seriousness, but like just because like. I find like arcadey shooting fun, and like this weekend I have like played like almost no Blackout because it's double XP weekend. Why wouldn't I be playing multiplayer and getting my numbers higher, right? Like, I've just been like all day yesterday, all this morning before I played some D&D, like just blops, and it's been fun. And I haven't quite burned myself out on it yet, which is surprising to me. I've been playing with different sets of people, so I think that's helped it, right? Like that. That like when I play with Monic and X, like I like playing team deathmatch, but X really doesn't. So we play like different control modes when we're doing that, and so like.
I feel that way. I typically don't like death matches. I typically like control mode games, which I think is because I played a lot of Battlefront 2. It's like one of my first big multiplayer shooter experiences, and there isn't deathmatch in that. It's always like capture points or whatever.
Yeah, and I feel that it's just like, and capture modes can hold me for a while, right? Like, because it like can slake my bloodthirst, but like I've got like really kind of hard, like you play the objective kind of like buzzers going off in my head, right? Like this is like when you're playing Overwatch, you stand on the cart, and like there are rooms for flankers, but I don't know. I feel like if I'm not doing the objective directly, I'm not like playing the game right. And so like when I want to kill people, I want to play team deathmatch because that's the point. But it's it's not so inflexible that I'm not able to kind of like switch off to do to try a different mode when other people want to. So that's been nice, right? Like just kind of like flitting through different versions. We've been playing a lot of Hardpoint, which is it's a control variation where like you have to hold an area, and then but like every 60 seconds the area moves, and so everything's kind of constantly up and going and moving around. It's a lot of fun. Along with like the team deathmatch stuff and smattering of other stuff too. Like something I really like is that COD has like playlists, and so like not only is there like when I go to play deathmatch, I don't play team deathmatch. I play the Chaos TDM playlist, which is a mixture of regular team deathmatch and kill confirmed. And I like that variation there. It keeps it fresh while I'm playing. But otherwise, the other thing that happened this week that I really want to talk to you about was I beat Spider-Man.
Oh, nice! Tell me all about it.
It is really great. So much so that I think that you need to figure out a way to play it. Like I don't know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like it's really good. Like so, like last week I said I had heard that this is the best piece of Spider media that isn't like like outside of the comic books, and I think I might agree with that. And I don't necessarily know that like it's the best piece of narrative content because like all video games, like all open world video games, pacing is not reliable, and so it's not necessarily the greatest. Because you have like uncontrollable amounts of filler. But the story was really neat. You could also tell that it was like it's a Marvel kind of like story, down to the fact that there's a fucking Stan Lee cameo in the middle of it.
Oh my god.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But it's really, really good, and I definitely think that you should try and figure out a way to play it. Like it is that good. They do some really cool things. Will say that I'm a little disappointed that the Sinister Six are kind of like not as big a part of the story as I thought they would be. Like that. Like, have you seen any gameplay of it? Have you seen like the kind of like chase of Electro on the raft?
Yes.
Yeah, that is like in the latter half of the game. If I think, it is, and like the actual fights with the Sinister Six are not so much of the game, but the game does a really good job of kind of like So a problem with open world games is or these types of open world games is like your power kind of constantly goes up, but a lot of like the baddies' power doesn't really go up.
And so you can outmode them.
Yeah, right. Like this happened a lot with Shadow 4, right? Like the goblins never really changed, or the orcs never really changed, but you kept getting more abilities. So the game just got easier. In this, at certain story points, you unlock basically like you start fighting like street thugs, and like you'll unlock different squads as the game goes on, and those are more difficult to fight. And have different tricks up their sleeves. So the difficult and they integrate themselves into the fake New York City. So the difficulty actually scales with the later parts of the game, which is a lot of fun. So I think that's actually a really well done piece of it. What else? I don't know. I think that like the costume stuff is really cool, right? Like there's so much that you can tap into because it's a known property.
I've always been a big. Have you ever played like Marvel Ultimate Alliance?
Yes, I love that game.
Oh my god! Can we just talk about how great that game is?
Absolutely.
But like yeah, I so get that because like there are like Marvel Ultimate Alliance, and you have these different costumes for these different characters, and it makes you want to play in different ways. In a certain sense, it's kind of like legendaries or like Azurite armor or whatever or like whatever else. So yeah, it is very cool to see that almost like legacy of gameplay not be dead, because I always thought that was a really great setup.
Yeah, no, and like I don't know, like it's just so much fun, like fooling around with new costumes, right? Like there are so many different like callbacks and different types of costumes. Like there's a negative energy costume, there's fear itself costume, there's the like the homemade wrestler costume. One of the last ones, and this isn't too much of a spoiler, but because they're not like tied to in-game events, but one of the last ones is the costume from The Last Stand, which I just immediately fell in love with that costume. I'd never seen it before. It's just so varied and so cool. Like just it's so neat. It's and like the web stuff is really good. Like,
does it make you feel like Spider-Man Mango?
I mean, I've never been Spider-Man, so I couldn't tell you, but I don't know if it feels good as somebody on a podcast that I listened to. I believe it was William, the Super Best Friend, said like swinging's got to be like the best form of transport because flying is kind of boring, especially like perfect flying. But like swinging has like just enough of like you need to like do some stuff, like you need to like have some real input in it to make it work effectively. But it's also like easy enough that it's not like super hard to do, if that makes sense. That it just works. Like, you know, like when you're flying, right, like you just kind of like go in a direction, but when you're swinging, right, like, you know, you'll be able to do it, but like if you're good enough, you could do it faster and you could do a little bit better and you could like optimize it. And that kind of like mini game just makes it fun, right? Like there's a fast travel system in the game. I used it like twice, I think, right? Even if the objective was across town, it's like, I'll go fucking swing it. It's so much like such a simple joy. I don't know. Like I said, figure out how to get yourself a PS4 and play the game because it's definitely worth it.
Yeah, I mean, something that makes that even more kind of like not relatable, but like even more pressing feeling is Red Dead Redemption 2 coming out in 5 days.
Yeah.
Right, which is console exclusive. Which sucks because I have this like incredibly powerful PC.
Yeah, no, I definitely feel that.
You know, and the whole point of making this, you know, as strong a consumer grade gaming PC as I could was so that I could play, you know, like these new games on release. But I think I'll have to settle for like the Cyberpunk and the, you know, like the Cyberpunks of the world in order to kind of get there.
Yeah.
Do you have any like intention to play Red Dead Redemption 2?
Maybe it's a weird because I have never been super into Rockstar games. I don't know why, but I just never have.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
Not even Red Dead Redemption 1, Grand Theft Auto 3, none of like the big ones?
No. Like, and I kind of like Red Dead Redemption should because it's like I love that like that Western stuff and like like that era of guns is always like super compelling to me. I don't know why, but it's like, you know, like whereas it's like it's not automatic firearms, it's not like blunderbusses. Although I do kind of like that kind of stuff in like D&D where like you're like the one gunslinger in the realm of like knights or whatever. But like that Western stuff is really my jam, and like I kind of do want to get it. But I'm not, like, for whatever reason, I'm not super excited about it. I'm sure... So the biggest thing for me right now, and the biggest thing that's holding me back from, like, pre-ordering it is because I'm kind of, like, in a transitionary period in terms of, like, where I'm going to live. My PlayStation 4 is out, but my Xbox One is packed away. But my brother only plays games on Xbox One. And so if I get it, I'm probably going to get it for Xbox One so I can play the multiplayer aspects with him. But until I do that, I'm not going to like dig it out of one of my boxes to set it up. Just have to pack it away again.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm kind of like we talked about Fallout 76 last week, but like these are games that are kind of like in the like I'm not so sure I'm going to get it, but like historically I've also known that like games like that like it'll like get praises sung to high heaven, and I'll get it within a couple weeks after its release. Anyway, that's actually exactly what happened with Spider-Man. I had no intention of playing Spider-Man. I just heard so much great stuff about it. I was like, yeah, whatever, and I picked it up and I loved it. So same thing with God of War. So I have to imagine I will get it, but I'm not like excited about it right now. It's weird.
That's interesting. Yeah, I loved Red Dead Redemption 1. Red Dead Redemption 1 might be one of the better of that eras of kind of like open world games or whatever, because the story was really good. There were a lot of like it was one of those games with like a lot of interesting characters and side stories, but the whole thing is like a giant wall to wall sort of like macro satire of like westerns. And I've seen plenty of satires of westerns, you know, like Unforgiven or whatever, right? Or like, you know, Django Unchained or what have you, The Hateful Eight. But like the problem with movies is that like the genre of westerns is so huge that you really can't cover everything in a movie, right? But you can cover everything in a game because games are a lot bigger than movies are, sort of thing. So like, boy, just everything gets skewered. You know, like the government and the outlaws and hack scientists, you know, hawking snake oil and, you know, racist townspeople about Native Americans and just like all of that stuff is it's just like really like ripe for like satire, and they go hard on all of it. Basically, the only character that's earnest is John Marston, right? Like the player character. And it's another great example of one of those games where like they make the player character so good that you get into, you know, that you get into it. I have a theory, like I think that Master Chief kinds of characters are pretty bad. Like those sort of Cypher characters are pretty bad. We've talked about them before, right? But it kind of means you need to like kind of empty out your gameplay in order to make it so that anybody could be doing the things that the things that they do. And John Marston isn't that. He is a very specific person. Though in the same way that like in Mass Effect or whatever, you get to make some choices. So like, you know, you have a limited ability to pilot an already pre-written and pre-voice acted character. He's a lot like that. But yeah, Red Dead Redemption 1, I have a lot of good things to say about it. But Rockstar itself, I have a lot of really bad things to say about, because I think that, frankly, I think that they are a company that gets away with stuff less than they should. Like, I feel like we have a lot of, you know, like gamers have kind of hawkish eyes on companies like EA or Activision to a certain extent.
Right.
But like the stuff that Rockstar pulled with Grand Theft Auto 5 is like ridiculously awful when it comes to like loot, you know, like loot boxes and stuff like that. It just never really made the mainstream. Because Grand Theft Auto 5 came out and they promised DLC both for the multiplayer, because they kind of had an MMO version, and for the single player, right? And they basically just completely abandoned all of their promised single player DLC in order to continue pumping multiplayer DLC, because what they did with the multiplayer is they sell these things called shark cards, which is just like, you know, gold, like buying gold in WoW. But whereas WoW creates a system where the value of the token, you know, like the value of the token is more about being a gold sink, and it's tied to what other players are buying and selling it at and all this other kind of stuff. The shark cards is just a flat fee for a bunch of money. And it basically, and like the success of the shark cards basically just encouraged them over the next 5 years to continue pumping sort of horse armor DLC where you're adding Lamborghinis and Ferraris for exorbitant prices in order to get people to buy shark cards, because they're never going to earn that much money in game. And I think it's awful, right?
Yeah.
They came out and they said that single player games aren't viable anymore. You have to have multiplayer games with a pay to win component. Otherwise you won't be able to pay off like huge development costs and stuff like that, right? Like, so I feel like a lot of the bad stuff like that we complain about a lot in the games industry from a monetary perspective, right? Is stuff that Rockstar has been committing this entire time, but kind of just like underneath the radar for whatever reason.
Yeah, so I think the key is it hasn't been this entire time, right? Like, I feel like if Red Dead Redemption launches with all this stuff intact, it'll like the kind of like the negative reaction will come, if that makes sense, right? Like, I think it's stuck under the radar because most of this came in when 90% of people were finished with Grand Theft Auto, right? Like, people, like, in terms of like the hardcore, I hesitate to call it this, but it's probably the best descriptor, activist gaming community didn't really care so much about the Grand Theft Auto 5 multiplayer. They cared about the single player stuff.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe they're a little bit aggravated that that the single player DLC never came, but they're not actively like playing like the multiplayer to the point where they need to buy shark cards. And, you know, I think a similar thing is that like, this like the worst abusive microtransaction stuff happened with sports games for years, I think. but like that activist community doesn't give a shit about Madden or whatever, right? So like they didn't care about any of that. So EA like built up this like dung heap of bad practices, and they put it in Battlefront 2, which is a game that like like the activist community cared about. And so that's when like kind of the retribution came. And
I also think that, you're right, and in a certain sense, I'm not really taking a longer view of history, because, like, EA has been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
EA was winning, worst company awards in 2007, right? 2008 when we went to college, sort of thing.
Right.
And I think, Red Dead Redemption is a really good game. I think it even has a multiplayer or whatever, right? But, like, Red Dead Redemption is a really good single-player game with, like, an expansive DLC pack that is, like, like a traditional expansion pack, and stuff like that. And so really it is just the advent of Grand Theft Auto and like the kind of pivot towards sort of shark card monetization in like 2014, 2015. So they don't have as long a history of like fucking over people as EA and Activision do.
Yeah. Activision has been able to withstand the brunt of it, but I think it's because Activision's managed to be a bit better. I don't know how or why, but like the most they usually get pinged for is like COD being repetitive.
I remember that there was some earlier stuff about Activision, specifically about Activision like buying things and like flooding the market and running them into the ground. Like this one I'm close to because it's a game that I like, but like that's what the Guitar Hero community always complained about.
Right.
Is like Activision comes out with, it's not. I mean, even COD comes out once a year or whatever, but like Guitar Hero, they were like 3 a year for like 2.5 years. And they just like completely flooded the market. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, maybe if we had actually spent some time with it and like spaced it out a little bit instead of just releasing like the new version of the game every 4 months, people wouldn't have been so sick of it and pissed about it.
Yeah.
As like time went on or whatever. They did the same thing with Tony Hawk. They did the same thing
right.
with COD, to a certain extent.
Yeah, I just don't feel like that stuck to Activision as a brand as much as it did to like the individual games, which is weird. But yeah, I wonder if, because like now that you mentioned that the Red Dead with the loot box stuff mirroring EA, the other thing that's like kind of mirroring EA is very recently they were like, yeah, we've been putting 100-hour weeks in on Red Dead, and I think they assumed they would be like, oh, how dedicated they are. Everybody was like, what are you doing to your employees, you fucking nutcases?
Yeah. I think the worst part about that is it came out right as the Telltale stuff was hitting, and so people were already pissed about how game development management was managing its people. But yeah, no, I agree. I think they thought that going very differently.
So I wonder if Rockstar is going to get EA'd soon, like in terms of like, outcry. We'll see. That we'll probably know within a month. But
yeah, I mean, I think it'll depend a lot on if Red Dead Redemption 2 is good. Yeah.
How's your week gone?
How's my week gone? So I've been playing a lot of WoW, but that's no fun. Who wants to talk about that? What I've been watching, interestingly enough, is so have you ever watched New Girl?
No.
So New Girl is a sitcom, and it stars Zooey Deschanel. And like it's the story of like she breaks up with her boyfriend and moves into a loft in Los Angeles with 3 dudes, and they're all wacky and they have like sitcom hijinks.
Yeah, it's like the start. It's like a big part of where the like manic pixie dream girl thing comes from, right?
She kind of, to a certain extent. I think the manic pixie dream girl exists predating this. In the sense of like it exists, or it like existed in like movies in the mid 2000s or whatever, before people were like, you know what. But so I've been watching New Girl, and it's great, and I love it, and I just wanted to say that, I guess I don't know why.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Is that all you've been watching?
No, I actually just finished some like other shows that I started watching. I started watching The Good Place, which I have heard amazing things about. It's by one of the creators of Parks and Rec. I think Zhao recommended to us, friend of the cast. Shout out Zhao. I know you told me to watch The Good Place, and I watched the first episode, and I said I should actually watch this with my wife. But and I've also been watching Glow. Have you ever seen Glow with Alison Brie?
I haven't seen it, but I've heard good things.
Yeah, it is awesome. Glow is kind of like a distillation. You know how I always talk about, like, I want to get into wrestling, but I don't actually.
Yeah.
It's basically been able to very thoroughly scratch that itch, because it is about... Glow is short for Gorgeous Ladies of Wrestling, and it's kind of like a docu-series, like, remake... docudrama, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where these are real people. This is based on real people doing real things, but it is the story of a super low budget ladies wrestling league that popped up in Los Angeles in the 80s and became like a cult classic for various reasons. So I've been watching Glow slowly, and it is fun, and it's lots of fun, and it's good. And in between there, I also rewatched The Kroll Show, because why wouldn't I?
So, speaking of shows that you may or may not have watched, what do you think about the cancellation of Iron Fist and Luke Cage?
Funnily enough, I feel personally responsible for them, because I didn't watch these. That they were the first Netflix seasons of these Marvel shows that I didn't just watch as soon as they came out. All of the other ones, Daredevil 1 and 2, Jessica Jones 1 and... I guess I didn't watch Jessica Jones 2. The Defenders, right? Like, as soon as it came out, I watched it, and then I complained about it a lot because I thought it was bad. And then Iron Fist and The Defenders were both really bad. And so I was like, you know what? I'm just not going to do it. I'm just like not going to watch these bad shows that are bad. And then boom, out of nowhere, they're getting canceled. So I am surprised. I thought these would kind of be moneymakers for Netflix to a certain extent. But I also sort of think that the deal itself between Marvel and Netflix has deteriorated as Disney is creating its own rival to Netflix. I just don't think that it's... I have a feeling that this is more a result of that deteriorating relationship than it is a result of deteriorating viewership. But I do think deteriorating viewership is a big piece of it too, because people are kind of over these. A couple of diehard sort of like fans I've seen on Twitter and stuff were complaining about it, or like in the Marvel Studios subreddit or whatever. But when you got into like the R Television subreddit, people were just kind of like, whatever.
Yeah, I wonder if like how part of this is like, it's not like making these shows is sales, right? Like,
right.
Like maybe it keeps someone from renewing their Netflix subscription, but I don't know how much I believe that. Because I don't know, it's Netflix's motivations in this situation are kind of weird, right? Because like it's not like television where like in addition to the subscription price you're also trying to like look to win eyes for ad space. You're just kind of like making the content to keep someone's subscription up, and like I wonder if Netflix ever hits a point where it like just has enough content that's like, we'll leave it here until you're sick of it, right? Like new releases are only as important as it keeps subscriptions rolling in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that they do it from a retention strategy.
Sure.
I'm sure these things are correlated, right? Which is like the more time you spend watching Netflix, the less likely you are to cancel a subscription, right? And so Netflix is just trying to constantly shovel content into the black hole of your eyeballs. And so I think when they have big misfires like this one, also Marco Polo is a good example of it. I also think House of Cards, like this is the definitely final season. And I mean, Kevin Spacey had his whole thing, obviously, but like even before that, we all knew that this was like the definitely end of the line for House of Cards, which is just kind of like, at the end of the day, these shows like run out their clocks. And yeah, everybody was really on board for the first season of House of Cards because the first 2 episodes were directed by David Fincher, and that first season was like really fucking good, and then it kind of like devolved over time. But I feel like they probably saw like a big tick down between season 1 and season 2, and they're like, all right. I also expect that those shows have a big budget, like a big cash budget on their hands.
Yeah.
Like Marco Polo had this problem where like it was like $10 million episodes or whatever, and that's just a lot of money to be shoveling into a 10-episode season, right? Like $100 million. It's like. It's just a ton of cash. And sure, you're trying to capture that Game of Thrones money or whatever, but yeah, I don't know. They just didn't get there.
It's weird because I think that actually the kind of like win state for Netflix is just enough, like you watch just enough to keep you paying, but not so much that like they actually want you to do no more than the minimum amount to keep you paying, because theoretically they make more profit if you're paying them $50 a month and not hitting their servers, right? Like they're not spending any money serving you content.
Yeah. Well, so I wonder about that, because I feel like if you're not spending time watching Netflix, there is a big chance that you're watching Amazon Prime or Hulu. Do you know what I mean? And they're like fighting for like that market share.
Yeah, I don't know. I think maybe part of it too is like, you know, like I don't consume a ton of content that isn't like that are TV shows or whatever. And like I feel like Netflix wants to be the default, right? Like if you have one, you have Netflix type of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And maybe that's enough. I don't know. It's interesting. I would very much like to like have someone like be a fly on a wall of like a business meeting at Netflix headquarters where they like discuss like what their actual objective is.
Yeah, I mean, I also think that Netflix looks at stuff like, you know, whatever it is, the DC universe and the Disney, you know, whatever they're going to call that package, and maybe laughs it off, and maybe they're much more worried about, okay, well, our real competitors are the other established brands in this field, right? You have Hulu, which is creating Emmy award-winning series, right, with like top-tier talent in there, and on top of that, they are also servicing that like when a new show comes out, it goes up on Hulu, because Netflix doesn't do any of that sort of thing. And then you're going up against Amazon Prime, right?
Right.
Amazon, the biggest company on the planet, practically. I think technically Apple is bigger. You know, that's a company that not only are they aggressively moving into this field, right? Producing Oscar award-winning movies, on top of their Emmy award-winning television shows or whatever, but they also have a much more diversified foundation on which to do those things. And so, you know, yeah, who cares if their version of Marco Polo, which is going to be the billion-dollar Netflix Lord of the Rings, falls flat on its face, right? Because they're a trillion-dollar company, right?
Yeah.
Like, so I don't know.
Yeah. Also, like, there's a weirdness there too, like just kind of in that space where like, even if it falls flat on its face, does that actually matter? Because people might watch it anyway, right? Like, I feel like Netflix is like the most insulated from critical reception ever, actually, because like, you know, like that Bright, that movie that we watched last year,
Yep.
like critically panned, got decent user ratings, and you know, enough people watched it that they ordered a sequel, right? Like,
Yeah.
you know, like, and like, I feel like people will watch that kind of thing just because they have Netflix and, you know, might as well, rather than like, you know, it's not like a movie where you have to like pay a fee to go see it, right? Like you already have it. I'd be very interested to see, like, my suspicion is that Netflix is the most of any of the different platforms, or you know, streaming is the most immune from critical reception to any to like versus like movies and television, because they're not trying to sell anything against it, right? You're not trying to sell tickets, you're not trying to sell advertising, you're just trying to keep a subscription up. And as long as somebody's willing to like, I'll like put it on while I like bleeding out on my couch, it's fine. But I don't know if I have any deeper thoughts on that. What about you?
Yeah, me neither. I super feel what you're getting at, though. I think that this stuff is interesting to talk about and think around, right? Like, not only that, you also have YouTube, which is kind of going the opposite direction in a lot of ways, because they're kind of like bottoming out and mining they're kind of like mining the market from below by just saying, here's the platform, do what the fuck you want with it. We're not going to give a shit about it, right? And obviously that means that they're hosting a bunch of crap that nobody watches, but they're also hosting a bunch of people who, make a living, right? And they're producing regular content, and they're hosting, people's Twitch streams or whatever else. So.
Yeah. Although I don't think YouTube is YouTube's biggest asset is the fact that it's attached to Alphabet, which will keep them alive, even though they're revenue negative, I think. Because the more they interfere with it, the more people get mad at them, because they can't run ads against their Elsa videos. I mean, but to be more, to be less kind of bitchy about it, right? People who want to discuss more mature things don't get advertisers run against them, and so they get screwed by revenue. I don't know. I pay for YouTube Prime.
I pay for YouTube Red. I actually very, very much enjoy YouTube Red. I think YouTube Red is one of the better of those subscription services that I
agree.
Pay into.
I love watching Vsauce's videos. Those that's the only Prime series or the premium series I regularly watch. But anyway, I think we're a little bit over time.
Indeed.
Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about before we wrap this up?
No, I don't. I guess we're done.
All right. Well, if that's the case, if you want to email us what you think about replayability or any of the other things we talked about in this podcast, you can email us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. Follow us at twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames, although we haven't done stuff in a while. Hopefully we'll finish out House Rebels soon.
Oh my god, I need to send a message about that.
Yeah. And maybe we'll get into something else after that. Maybe we'll get something done for the Pathfinder playtest. Maybe. Otherwise, you can check out these videos on YouTube, or you can check out this podcast in video form on YouTube. What else? You can follow us on Twitter, leave us reviews on iTunes, all that good stuff. Buddy, do you have anything else you want to promote?
I have nothing else I'm looking to promote.
In that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.